Hi, everybody. Welcome back to PCS 101. And this is for our class for Wednesday, the 31st of December, the last day of the year. So, what I wanted to talk about today was the Toastmasters video that I asked you to watch last class, as well as a couple of the chapters that I had assigned for you. And the Toastmasters video emphasizes the importance of practice, and I too can't illustrate how important it is to practice. So, the more practice you get, the more comfortable you're going to be with delivering your speech. And remember that this is not an exercise in perfection. What you want to have is a sense of connection with your audience. You want to have a sense of humanity with your audience. So you're not going to be sounding robotic and you're not going to be sounding like a chatbot. You're going to be sounding like a human being. So the way to go about doing that, put all of your efforts into initially preparation, thinking about the logistics of the situation, the location, the audience, the objective. And of course, you have an advantage because you already know what the objective of the assignment is to allow you to introduce yourself to your audience for your first speech. But from my perspective, the objective is also in terms of what we've been talking about and we'll be talking about with speech delivery for you to actually incorporate some of those skills. Think of this class as a kind of workshop, if you will. And your audience, you also are at an advantage because your audience will be made up of your classmates and myself. And as you know, I had indicated that you will be uploading your recorded speeches onto Moodle, and your classmates will be watching those and responding back to me with a strength and a weakness for each of the class's speeches so that I can compile all of that data, share it with you. But watching other individuals perform is just as instructive as actually performing yourself. And there is an element of performance associated with this. But again, you don't expect perfection. And I've oftentimes said that this is not a class in video editing. And the idea is that you're doing it in one take, much like if you were delivering a speech live, you would be doing it within that particular moment. And that said, individuals can have lots of different objectives and reasons that could be in addition to the class. I always give an example of a colleague of mine who basically taught public speaking at another institution nearby. I won't say which. And it happened to be about the importance of being true to oneself. It was a very philosophical speech. What ended up happening over the course of the speech is that the student began to disrobe. And as the student began to unbuckle their pants, the teacher stopped the speech and asked what was going on. And the student responded that they wanted to show their true selves. And I'm not exactly sure what their specific objective was. Certainly, I know they were trying to stun and shock the audience. But may I suggest that they didn't think about the audience or the location or the fact that it would be inappropriate to do such a thing in the context of an academic situation. So always think about all of the elements that are necessary for you to be able to be effective with your audience. And might I suggest that this student did not do that? So, in terms of thinking about dividing up your speech, it'll have three parts: an introduction, a discussion section is what Toastmasters called it, or a conclusion. And that said, it sounds very similar to writing an academic paper because, in many respects, it is. You have to have a hello, you have to have some details and evidence, and you have to have a conclusion. You've got to find a way to cue in your audience that you have come to an ending. You do want to be conversational, and that means that you want to be able to have a speaking outline that will help and not hurt you. In other words, keywords and phrases so that you can maintain eye contact with audience or eye contact with the camera, whatever the case may happen to be. So, what you're doing is filling in, as the Toastmasters video talked about, unscripted language amongst the pointed details that you might have in, let's say, a speaking outline. You want to think about things like eye contact and body language and vocal inflections and pauses. And pauses can be very effective in terms of building dramatic tension or just even allowing you an opportunity to breathe. And the disadvantage, obviously, is that you can't read the body language of your audience because you are going to be recording your speeches. Try to anticipate audience questions and address what those questions might be because, again, you don't necessarily have the audience present so that they could ask you those questions during or after the particular speech. And as I indicated, the Toastmasters video doesn't spend a whole lot of time talking about anxiety, which is what I call it the elephant in the room, which is why I had you for your last attendance question talk a little bit about ways to reduce anxiety. And I don't have a magic bullet for you, but I can definitely tell you that preparation and practice is one of the ways to reduce anxiety. Breathing is another way to reduce anxiety because we tend to hold our breaths when we are anxious. I'll always remember taking a women's self-defense class. One of the things we talked about, if we were ever attacked, that we should yell out the word no. And it wasn't to draw attention to ourselves. That was secondary. The primary reason was just to force oxygen into our lungs at a point where we would be likely holding our breath. But this would be the point where we would need oxygen the most because we would either fight or flee. So do keep in mind the importance of taking pauses, the importance of breathing. I've even had students talk about how they have included that in their speaking outline and found that to be very effective, just to remind themselves to breathe after particular points in time. I suggest that you wear something that feels comfortable. Certainly don't wear something that's new, I would recommend, because you're not necessarily sure how it's going to feel, but do wear something that's appropriate for the audience. We're a pretty informal society, so you don't necessarily have to dress up per se for a speech class, but you do want to make sure that you're dressed appropriately for an academic situation. So what you would wear to class probably is what would be appropriate for when you are recording yourself. And thinking about how you're going to record yourself. Do you want to do something similar to what I'm doing, where you're sitting and you're recording and focusing on the face and part of the torso? The face is very important because you want to be able to see facial expressions. That's how most of us read a speaker's intent, as we will talk about. Do you want to be standing in full body? And then again, you want to make sure that your body language is appropriate and you aren't doing things like fidgeting or pacing. And you want to think about things like lighting, which is going to be important. We want to be able to see you. Thinking about volume, making sure that we can hear you. Thinking about your background, that you want something that isn't too cluttered, or you want to find a way to obscure your background. So again, it doesn't have to be something that reflects perfection, but something, again, that would be appropriate for an academic situation. And the textbook talks about trait apprehension, where there are individuals who have generalized anxiety. And if that's you, then it probably will be even more important to think about ways to reduce anxiety, whether it be meditation, whether it be listening to music. Music has oftentimes been found to reduce anxiety, particularly classical music. But again, if you don't like classical music, that might not be the best form of music for you to listen to. Certain scents have been found to reduce anxiety, lavender, for instance. But again, If you don't like lavender, then that's probably not in your best interest to be smelling before you are going to be delivering a speech. Making sure that you're well rested, making sure that you've got a good speaking outline in the event that you were to lose your place. You might never even look at your speaking outline, but if you're well prepared, you may not even need to look at your speaking outline, but it's there just in the event that you do lose your train of thought. You could think of it as a kind of security blanket, or I've likened it perhaps to the idea of a trapeze artist always having a net underneath them, even though they rarely, if ever, fall. But it's just a good idea just in case. And I think of the speaking outline in a very similar kind of way. So, regardless of what techniques you use to help reduce anxiety, some anxiety is good because it means that you are invested in the situation. So, I myself always feel a little bit of anxiety, a little bit of nervousness before the beginning of a semester. It goes away as soon as classes start. But I had a colleague of mine tell me years ago that when that does go away, if it does go away, that anxiety, is probably time to retire, but I still feel those butterflies in the stomach, so to speak, at the beginning of each semester, which is good because that shows again that you care about the situation. State apprehension, situational anxiety, everybody is going to feel a certain level of anxiety when it comes to either taking an exam or, in this particular instance, public speaking. So much so that it's got its own term, glossophobia, the fear of public speaking. So that said, and I hope that you had the opportunity to watch the Toastmasters video, but if you didn't, definitely watch it now because you will see that I've covered the major points of the video. And the chapter that I had assigned for today, the need for public speaking, talks a little bit about why public speaking is such a useful class, not just because it may satisfy an academic requirement or help you along with your degree requirements or credits, but because it's a real world skill that you will be putting into practice, that we utilize public speaking techniques every day. We talk to family, we talk to friends, we talk to colleagues, and we oftentimes are in situations where we've got to speak to groups of individuals. So there's a reason why Toastmasters is called Toastmasters, and it has nothing to do with the idea of heated bread being toast. The idea of a Toastmaster is somebody who can give a toast at a formal event. In other words, when you're asked to speak, let's say, before you have a sip of champagne, before, let's say, a wedding, for instance, or bar mitzvah. So the idea is that regardless of whether it is in the professional world or the academic world or in the personal world, you're going to have to utilize public speaking techniques. And speeches are integrative. The idea is that they show shared values. They're redundant. You will use more repetition that you would probably use as a writer because people have notoriously poor memories, and more on that as the semester progresses. You'll want to be as concrete and specific as possible because, again, it's not as if somebody can go back and reread what it was that you said. And of course, as I've been discussing, speeches are situational. The time and the place will dictate what you talk about and how you talk about it. So you have the speaker, that's the source of the message. You have the message, which is information, but it also includes attitudes about that information, emotions associated with that information. And then you have the listener who receives and interprets the message. And it should be a kind of feedback loop so that the listener responds and the speaker is able to address those responses, whether they be literal, somebody raises their hand, or whether they be more subtle, for instance, body language, and adjust within reason. And of course, that's something that you can't necessarily do in a pre-recorded speech because you're not going to have an audience. However, I have had students tell me that they will oftentimes have family or friends sitting off onto the side away from the camera so that they can have the experience of speaking to an audience. In fact, even something like a stuffed animal. could serve as a kind of faux audience, which actually was something that occurred during COVID. Was a news story about a professor who was unaccustomed to teaching online and was all of a sudden required to, and he was accustomed to teaching basically large lecture courses, which he now had to record in an empty lecture hall. And what he did is he just put out a few stuffed animals in some of the seats so that he would have at least something to direct his message to. So that said, think about the speaker, the message, the audience, and then the speaker. This is really a transactional, interactive, circular thing in terms of speaking, rather than linear. It's not just a one-way message or relational that you get feedback and then there's no response. So, and hopefully, you can think about some of the ways that your speech is going to live up to expectations, but perhaps we don't necessarily see in the real world. I have oftentimes said that this is a challenging class to teach because we talk about things that we don't necessarily see modeled in the real world, that you need to be clear, that you need to be logical, that you need to be ethical. And of course, there are lots of people in the public speaking realm who aren't doing those things. And they are rewarded quite handsomely with money and power. And I suggest that we should hold them to a higher standard. If you know anything about the great oral tradition, this goes all the way back to the Greeks. And Aristotle had talked about the importance of logos or logic, the importance of ethos or ethics, and the importance of pathos or emotions. And I am particularly interested in the idea of ethos and ethics, especially when it comes to something like artificial intelligence. Of course, the ethics of using artificial intelligence, or even the fact that artificial intelligence is building its systems on the information derived from others, but those others aren't receiving compensation for that, is, I think, highly problematic. So a news story I was just reading today was about a artificial intelligence bot that was created to mimic an actor, and that Hollywood is up in arms over this. That this is the perfect actor who never ages and doesn't require large salaries and lots of other elements. So what this means or doesn't mean, I don't know, but even though others may not be ethical in the way they present themselves publicly, we expect ethics within an academic situation. And ethos or ethics is just, and it does sound like ethics, is credibility, good sense, goodwill, good morals. And think about the importance of civil discourse. Somehow, some way, we as a society have got to find a way to disagree with one another in a civil way. And I've seen my students do it, certainly during the persuasive speech, where oftentimes subjects are discussed that are very controversial. So if we can do it, we should hold others to that standard as well. Why study public speaking? There is something called an intellectual imperative, which is just a fancy way of saying, as a well educated individual, you should know about public speaking. You should know about orality. If you know anything at all about literature, then you know the great literary tradition began through oral sharing of stories, great epic poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, for instance. Social imperative, as I was talking about, human interaction, that we're going to be at social functions, we're going to be at professional functions, we're going to be in academic functions that will require us to interact with one another. And the consumer imperative, which I'm becoming more and more interested in as an audience member, again, listening to the speeches of others, especially those speeches of individuals in the political realm or in the public realm that don't necessarily hold up to the level of, um, let's say, ethics or credibility or logic that we would expect in an academic situation. So, the second chapter that I had assigned was about different perspectives. That, of course, you're going to have an audience that's made up of a lot of different people with a lot of different perspectives. And again, the idea isn't that everybody's going to agree with you. That's an impossibility, and it's also not desirable. I think that one of the greatest strengths is that we can, as individuals, disagree with one another. That's why we're individuals. There will be diversity, which only means difference, basically, within audiences. And this is where we start talking about culture. And we can have an entire semester devoted to culture, but basically, culture is any kind of group membership, I guess, in the broadest sense of the term. And culture includes things like beliefs, what individuals think are true or false, attitudes, the emotions individuals might have, values, which tend to be very highly ingrained within individuals. And that said, you want to make sure not to overgeneralize. You don't want to stereotype and assume that everybody in a particular cultural group is the same, but you can assume that certain cultures have a certain level of a predictive element to them. So, behaviors might be something that you can anticipate. The way people dress, for instance. So, you can assume that people dressing in an academic classroom might be dressed differently than they might be dressed, let's say, in an office, in a professional situation. The values and attitudes can change, but they can also be highly ingrained. And again, there are individual elements of it, but I can just about predict that most students think, for instance, that textbook expenses are too high. And, that's a belief that they have, and that also is reflected in their attitudes and in their values, about what's important and what's not important. And not that every student is going to think that way, but I've got a general sense at this point, after all of these years of teaching, of, your typical student is going to be dressed in a typical sort of way and is probably going to feel, for instance, that textbooks are a burdensome expense, even though there could be variation and difference within that. So, the idea of cultural intelligence, showing sensitivity, showing competence, effectively understanding and adapting to differing cultural perspectives. And again, going back to artificial intelligence, and I have this in the notes below under the third section about how artificial intelligence is known to show quite a few biases. So, there's an article here about Grok, but there are many other artificial intelligence programs that do similar sorts of things that overgeneralize because, again, they're programmed on basically humans, and humans are basically flawed. So, keep that in mind again as one of the many, many reasons why you need to be very cautious with the use of artificial intelligence. Um, Ideally, what you would do to be a culturally intelligent person is to have empathy and to be able to take someone else's perspective, which I can tell you is one of the goals of literature. And I am also an English teacher. The idea of reading literature allows you to read about different perspectives and different life situations, and allows you to take the perspective of someone else. Um, of course, active listening, paying attention to what people are saying, and I believe I mentioned that we have notoriously poor memories, and we also have notoriously poor listening skills, which we will be talking about as the semester progresses. And there is a difference between listening, which is paying attention, as opposed to hearing, which is just processing sound. And obviously, we want to do more than just process sound. We want to actually listen. So, at this point, my hope is that you've gotten a sense of some of the elements to consider when you are putting together your first speech. Speech number one being a 5-minute speech, autobiographical speech, where you tell the audience a little bit about yourself, whether you want to give a life overview or perhaps you want to focus on a particular time period or a particular element in your life. If you aren't quite sure what to talk about or you're not too comfortable with self-disclosure, you might want to devote your speech to education, which is the topic that all of us share in one way or another. So you might want to talk about your educational past. Or you might want to talk about your educational present and how you ended up in this particular course, or your educational future and your plans for that. But regardless of what it is that you want to talk about, you've got 5 minutes in order to greet your audience. That's your introduction. Give us a little bit of information. That's your body or discussion section. And then finally, conclusion. Give us a sense that you're coming to a sense of closure. And we will talk more about how to put together speeches, how to write outlines, and even see some sample autobiographical speeches before you actually have to deliver your speech. But as you know, the intercession is a very condensed time period. So the sooner you start thinking about this, the better off you are. And there's no reason for you not to think about speech number 2, which is an informative speech for 10 minutes, and your persuasive speech, which is a 15-minute speech where you're trying to convince your audience of a position or to take an action or a behavior, or perhaps a combination of the two. In fact, I've had some students have all three speeches connect. So something that they mentioned, the autobiographical speech, is something they can pursue in the informative speech, perhaps even the persuasive speech. So, in an autobiographical speech, you might want to talk about how you happen to be, let's say, a football fan. And then in the informative speech, you tell us about the history of football. And then in the persuasive speech, perhaps you should argue that GCC should establish a football team. Um, but all three speeches do not have to be connected. They could be completely separate from one another. And certainly, you want to focus your attention on the first speech because that's what's coming up first. That gives you the opportunity to practice some of the skills that we've been talking about with public speaking. So, since today is the 31st, if you are watching this on the 31st, I do not have an attendance question because I am well aware that we are on the cusp of a holiday. So, at this point, you would have had two attendance questions. The first being to introduce yourself, the second being to talk about nerves. So, these were questions that you could address if you still didn't have an opportunity to read the textbook. But my hope is that by next week, you will all have the textbook and be all caught up. So while we will not have class on the 1st, which is Thursday, because that's a holiday, and I will post that on our Moodle site, that I'm not posting a video on that date because that is a holiday. We will reconvene on Friday, the 2nd, where we will continue to talk about the textbook. As you know, I put most of the textbook readings up front so that ultimately we would have that information when we were preparing for delivering our speeches. So, with that said, I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. Have a happy and safe New Year's, and we will continue on Friday. Take care. Bye bye.